Hello, my name's Andy. Welcome to episode 16 of Keeping Water. With the first of the winter's proper frosts already here, in this video I was going to show you some of the additions I make to address the worst of the cold weather. However, a couple of mini disasters meant that I didn't quite get to complete that. I'll cover what happened and how the water temperature and testing has gone in this episode's weekly update. Before that, I'm going to move away from pond keeping a little and talk about how I edit my videos to create a more natural look to my fish. There are timestamps in the description below if you want to skip around the video. Right, let's get started. A big part of this channel, and also how I keep and observe the fish, is underwater filming. This is for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I don't have fish that are so easily appreciated from above the surface of the water as koi and goldfish are. Secondly, they're skittish, so observing them closely is quite difficult. I also enjoy watching them from their perspective, seeing how the pond works for them and observe them as if it was their natural environment. Therefore, rarely a week goes by without the GoPro being placed in the pond, and usually some of what I capture ends up in that week's episode, or in a future one if about a specific topic. The GoPro, however, is quite old, and as I mentioned in episode 11, and again briefly in last week's episode, it has some technical limitations. It doesn't record well in low light and gives quite a washed out look to the fish. I can't spend money on better equipment, so to improve the final output and to give a more representative look to the fish and their environment, I've begun to use some filters during editing to improve the end result. I use Shotcut to edit my videos. The reason why I use it are that it's free, it has some reasonable reviews, and it's quite easy to learn. It isn't as powerful as some more expensive and professional video editors, but so far it's done everything I want it to do. How I filter my underwater videos is quite simple, but does include a little bit of judgment and personal preference. Anyway, here's the process. Right, so here's a couple of videos open in Shotcut, both raw footage with no filters applied. If you don't know Shotcut, to the top left is the playlist, which consists of media I could use in the video. In the middle at the top is the current video I'm working on. At the bottom is the timeline, and at the top right is a video waveform, which will become more useful in a bit. The first thing I'm going to do with this first clip is to adjust the white balance. This filter basically adjusts the video's colours to look more natural. You start by selecting the filter, then choosing the dropper, and then clicking on what appears to be the closest colour to white in your video, and you'll see the colours change straight away. Next, colour grading. I basically use this to accentuate the shadows and highlights to give more depth to the image. Again, choose the filter. This is when the waveform is important. You need to increase the wave's coverage between 0 and 100 by darkening the shadows and lifting the highlights, giving more range and depth to the video. First, shadows. Drag the slider down so that the bottom of the wave is as close as you can make it to 0 without causing it to overlap. Then use the highlight slider. Drag it up to raise the top of the wave as close as you can to 100, again without it overlapping. I think the image quality is much better now, with the dark rich colours of the fish being more accurately displayed. If I briefly turn off the filters, you can see the original video has much more washed out colours and far less depth. I'll now apply this to another clip. This clip was shot in the summer and actually had pretty good lighting and looked okay, but, in my opinion anyway, can still be improved upon. I've already selected a clip from it, so I'll drag this down to the timeline. So again, we'll choose the white balance filter and then click on the dropper. Then find the whitest part of the video and click on it. Next, colour grading again. Click on the filter, then adjust the shadow slider to lower the wave as close to 0 as possible. Then use the highlight slider to raise the wave towards 100. Again, I'll turn the filters off to have a look at what it was like before. Finally, I'm going to add one more clip and add the filters to it. This one is my favourite video of the temps. I'll add it to the playlist, then choose the part I want and add it to the timeline. With that chosen, I can once again add the filters. This time, however, the result is a little too dark throughout the image, so I also lighten the midtones, which I think gives a better range of colour and brightness. Again, another look at the video without the filters. As you may know, I'm really simplifying this process and only scratching the surface of this method of image manipulation. Additionally, there is a large degree of personal preference involved, although I think the colour of the fish especially is more consistent with their true look. I'd be interested to hear what other people think, so please share your views in the comment section below. To start this weekly update, I'm going to share the 2 issues I've had with the pond this week. After not having much time last week for work on the pond, I planned this week to get ready some of the additions I make to the pond to combat the colder weather, either temporarily or throughout the season. Anyway, while starting the first stage of this work, I noticed a very small leak by one of the rubber connectors on the pipework just as it enters the shed. Holding it to have a closer look, I managed to make it worse and mostly flooded the shed. As I was a little bit annoyed by this, I completely forgot to video any of it, but I set about fixing it by draining the filter and as much of the pipework as I could, then moving the multi-bay out from the shed wall a little bit so I could get to the pipework more easily. That done, I replaced the rubber connector as it felt a little brittle and reconnected the pipework. I obviously then turned the pump back on and waited for the water to flow back into the filter, but none arrived. Everything else was working, air pump, UV, etc., but no water. I checked all the obvious nearby things. Was the gate valve open properly or broken? Was there a massive leak I was missing? But I couldn't spot anything, which meant that the pump had either died or was no longer connected to the pipework, which, if you've watched a previous winter prep episode, you'll know happens from time to time. Rather than jump straight into the pond to check it, I had a quick look with a GoPro instead, which told me pretty quickly that the pump had detached itself. So, on with the waders and into the really quite chilly pond. It didn't take too long though, and was all working again quickly. No leaks so far, but I'll wait and see before continuing with the winter additions. Next, temperatures. Winter's fast on its way. Temperature in, but mostly out of the pond, are dropping fast, and this is obviously having an effect on the fish. As you'll probably know, as the water cools, the fish's metabolism slows down, and with it their appetite, ability to digest food, especially protein-rich food, ability to fight infections, and their activity levels. There's some good advice to recommend feeding lower protein food, usually wheat germ, once the water temp gets below 13 degrees, and not feeding your fish at all once the water gets below 10 degrees. For the last fortnight my pond has been below 13 degrees, so I've only been feeding wheat germ, and in the last couple of days, as it's dropped below 10 degrees, I've stopped feeding. That's not to say I won't feed the Puddle during winter and when it's below 10 degrees, but that I'm cautious. If I see them actively looking for food, especially when the temperature has risen a couple of degrees, then I'll offer some wheat germ pellets. However, I'll only put in tiny amounts and only once a day at most. Looking back at the temperature chart, what's notable is that for the last week or so the water has been warmer than the air. This tends to be the case during winter, although there may be odd sunny days when the air temperature briefly rises above the pond. Just for clarity, I only take the temperature once a day at a reasonably set time in the afternoon. This time was chosen as it's when I'm most likely to be home consistently. Like many, I'm working from home in the main, although I have to also go out on visits, even during lockdown, but more often than not these will be in the morning. Therefore, these temps are probably about the maximum temps, not minimum. You may have spotted in one of the earlier clips in this episode that the temperature was 9 for water and 2.7 for the air. This was at about 8 o'clock, and although the water hasn't changed much, the air clearly has, and even more so considering that it was down to 0 overnight. I'm never, short of a lottery win, going to be able to heat my pond, and even some form of rigid covers will be difficult, although not impossible. I'm giving it some thought. Again, more on this in an upcoming episode. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Keeping Water. I really do appreciate it. It turned out to be a very different episode than I'd planned, due to a couple of pipework issues and my new test kits once again not turning up. So I plan to include some cold weather prep in next week's episode and some new testing. But failing that, I may have to go with one of my other backup winter episode plans. We'll see. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.